Hello, everybody. This is Erik Bohlin. I'm a professional therapist, and I'm going to be talking about my understanding of the 12 steps and how they change our lives. This will be for any addiction, or some people have used this for other problems. I found it useful in my own life. I'll start off by saying I only know a little. There is so much there, but it's a very simple program, and one doesn't need to understand it all to actually get better. We're going to talk about the history of how this all started. In America in the 1920s, 1930s, there were a lot of people struggling with alcoholism. A group of people formed an organization, I believe not in America, but it was called the Oxford Groups. And the Oxford Groups had very similar practices as early Christianity. They were primarily Christian people. It was non denominational. They didn't quibble over their understanding of God, but really tried to seek to have a deep relationship with God. And so I'm going to point you to some of the things if you're interested in this. We know the AA book. The AA book was written, I believe, in 1939, I believe. And there's 12 steps here. But originally, there were four basic steps, four basic processes. When Bill writes the 12 steps and says, these are the steps we took, technically, it wasn't that they had 12 steps. They didn't. The 12 steps actually came after they wrote the book. Also, the Alcoholics Anonymous, they named themselves after the book. Prior to this, for about 4 years, there were a group of alcoholics that were attending Oxford groups and then broke away. And the four basic processes were total surrender to God. It was totally letting go of control. The second process, or the second, I guess I'm avoiding the word step on purpose because they just did four things. And there were other principles. If you dig into Oxford groups, you'll see online that there was more principles that they lived by. The second process was confession or sharing. They believed that to be healed, they had to share their life with a God, another human being, and confess their wrongs and their sins one to another, that they may be healed, as kind of described in the book of James. The next area was restitution, they called it, or what we would call amends. It was mending relationship. It was putting back those relationships, like putting back what we had taken, how we have harmed, tried to heal, tried to repair, restore. Because the belief was if they weren't going to do that, they would never really have a relationship with God. It would block God's grace or God's power. And then the last process was what they called guidance, that they really believed God would guide their lives if they asked Him for it. And you'll see actually about 20 plus 26 references to guidance. Once you get through the steps, and we'll go through the steps together, you will see that, wow, it's just all over the place. And that perhaps what people are doing today aren't really part of what they did here. So we're going to go through this together. I call it taking the steps together. If you want other resources, I would say that probably the next thing one could read is Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers and Pass It On. They're both books written many years afterwards, but it goes into the AA history. And when I first read these, I was amazed at how much more history there was. Two, that it was not just Dr. Bob and Bill, that there were other people involved. In fact, probably one could say about 100 people were involved. You also learn about how that going to lots of meetings was not as important as actually practicing step 10 and 11. You'd see that in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 131 to 136. It's a favorite section there for me to read to people that at the time there was such a miracle happening in the lives of these alcoholics that other people got involved. And one of them was uh, John John Rockefeller, and they were going to give money. And after prayer, they decided against it. They gave some money, but it wasn't going to be funded by any outside sources. It was going to be done by their own members. That's why the phrase "we are self-supporting," denying outside contributions. Here's a picture of the convention. I believe that happened in 1950. Dr. Bob was there. He spoke. He actually said something. You can hear it online. In essence, I'm paraphrasing. He says, "Do not let psychotherapy ruin the simple program." Now, his words are things like Freudian complexes and psychoanalysis, but that was the term for counseling as we know it today. And I do believe, even though I'm a therapist, even though I think it's very valuable to have psychology, self-orientedness, self-striving, self-willed, self-powered, self-directed tends to make any addiction worse. We have to totally empty ourselves of ourselves by God's grace, and by then we'll be granted sobriety. Other books, there's Dick B. I'll put links to these in the description. Very useful. When you read this, you go, whoa, this is so different. I believe he is an attorney, and he goes through and cites everything. And he'll talk about how in this record that, you can see the steps worded this way, and then by this person, this interview with that person, and you'll go, whoa, this is really, really useful. This is what was happening in Akron, Ohio. There's other books. Bill, as Bill sees it, you'll see Bill Wilson progress. This is a little devotional. And you'll see that it's just nice to go back in time and to see, oh, well, that's how they were really thinking. This I picked up. This is Father John Doe, or Ralph Fow. And so you'll see his understanding. You can hear him speak. He was not afraid to talk about God. Who would be afraid to talk about God? Well, today, sometimes it's like we use very generic terms like higher power, and I just see that as disrespectful to God. That's my opinion. The very person who I owe everything to get me sober, do I really want to be embarrassed to say his name? That's just actually people who can't tolerate that aren't working a good program, because it's love and tolerance as our code. So anyway, there's other. Now, this is a newer book. I haven't read all these. I mean, I've read a lot, but not all of them. This is Writing the Big Book. This is bigger than the book. This goes into the details of just how the AA book was written. And you start to get a lot of history. Does someone need to read all this to get sober? Absolutely not. In fact, I would say that would overwhelm anybody, and people would just be very upset. This is another book, The Spirituality of Imperfection. You'll see how it's related to early Christianity and all these references. But to get through the steps together, this is what we're going to use. It's going to be very simple. In fact, if you've been struggling for years, you might find that this is almost fun. It's not about being fun, but it's much, much better than what I was doing prior in my life for 10 years, struggling and not getting sober. And then once I did the steps as outlined in this AA book, I got sober. With that, you have a really good day.